I thought I should ask you all to come to just give you an update with reference to the scrap metal industry. You will recall that I think it was on the 12th of August I had a press conference with the Minister of National Security on the day that the government passed the legal notice introducing the 6-month ban on the export of scrap metal. And at that press conference, I gave the commitment to the industry that I would attempt to get the very able members of the team of the Attorney General's chambers working with the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the Ministry of National Security to come back to the population and to the industry in 3 months to give an update before the expiry of the ban on the 28th of February 2023. And I'm happy to advise members of the media and the public of Trinidad and Tobago that I've actually just half an hour ago had a consultation with the stakeholders of the scrap metal industry, including Mr. Ferguson and a number of other persons, quite a number of them. In fact, I'll have the number of persons who attended that consultation for you shortly. And I've been able to advise the stakeholders in the scrap metal industry, as I'm advising the public now, that I took a draft bill to Cabinet yesterday, which bill is, we hope, going to be passed into law before the end of this year to introduce a new legislative regime to the scrap metal industry and therefore to bring forward the period of the ban under 6 months to end of December 2022. And the purpose of my asking you to come today is to just give you some of the highlights of what that bill intends to do. It will, of course, repeal the old 1949 Metal and Marine Act, which is the legislation that currently governs the scrap metal industry. Very significantly, the bill that is going to be approved by Cabinet, and I should pause there just to introduce one further thought. When I took the bill to Cabinet yesterday, Cabinet decided that it would be fair to give the stakeholders in the industry one further opportunity for consultation before Cabinet approves the bill. So what Cabinet did yesterday was to adjourn the Cabinet note that I brought to the Cabinet to the Finance and General Purposes Committee, which meets on Monday, in order to enable me this morning to meet with the stakeholders in the industry. That is, having regard to the importance which Cabinet recognizes this industry represents to the stakeholders, particularly small people in this country. And it was a considered view of the Cabinet, led by Prime Minister Dr. Rowley, that we should not take the bill to the final policy decision stage until we've given those stakeholders one final opportunity to comment. So I met this morning with the stakeholders. We've received comments. We've invited them to send in further written comments to us before Monday morning when we go to F&GP to finalize all of the stakeholders' considerations as best as we are able to in that bill, which will then go to Cabinet on Thursday, I beg your pardon, for approval after it considers the bill. And then what will next happen is that the bill will be taken to the Legislative Review Committee, which consists of a subcommittee of ministers of government to review the bill to ensure that all of the public interest considerations and stakeholder interests are addressed appropriately. And then we will ask the Speaker of the House to list that as one of the bills for Parliament before the end of this year. So that's the schedule that we have in mind at the moment to bring the law into force by the end of December at the very latest. The outline of the bill is very fundamental. What it does in the first instance is it moves the jurisdiction for regulation of the industry oversight into the Ministry of Trade and Industry. So the Ministry of Trade and Industry will regulate the scrap metal industry going forward. Among the things that that bill does is it enables the Minister of Trade and Industry to appoint scrap metal inspectors. There are going to be provisions for all collectors to be licensed, all dealers to be licensed, all scrap metal sites will be licensed, and loading of scrap metal for export into containers is going to be required to take place at the scrap metal sites, and at the point of loading, the scrap metal dealers who manage and own those sites will be required to serve notice on the Ministry of Trade to enable the Ministry of Trade to ensure that a scrap metal inspector is present at the site to inspect what is being loaded into the containers. Given the significant criminality which took place with respect to the stripping of copper from very important fundamental infrastructural parts of Trinidad and Tobago, electricity, cable and wireless, communications, and other components of the national security infrastructure that allow us to communicate underground and other fiber optic cables of national state institutions and a lot of private institutions. The government, even though it has widened the definition of scrap metal, and I will read that definition, has decided to keep the ban on copper exports for at least one further year. So the new legislation which is coming into force will not allow the export of copper as part of scrap metal. So scrap metal in the bill is widened in terms of definition, and it will involve, it includes, and I'm reading from the definition section of the bill, includes any industrial scrap metal, old metal, second-hand metal, discarded metal, broken metal, defaced or old metal goods, including machinery and plant, whether wholly or partly manufactured, ferrous metal, non-ferrous metal, ferro-alloyed metal, marine stores, but does not include gold, silver, or metals of the platinoid group. So that's the expanded definition of scrap metal. But in non-ferrous metal, the definition of non-ferrous is now reads, non-ferrous means metals that do not contain iron and include metals such as nickel, aluminum, lead, zinc, and tin, but does not include copper. So copper is taken off the export list of scrap metal for at least another year. The government will, of course, revisit that issue in the course of the year. Regulations are being built out to support the legislation that is coming into force this year. Those regulations are going to be built out as soon as possible in consultation with the scrap metal industry stakeholders. We discussed that with them this morning. And other things that have been proposed in the bill that we've taken to Cabinet, which, just to give you an idea, is that everybody, as I've said, is going to have to be licensed, and a number of very heavy penalties will now apply for persons who run afoul of the new legislative regime. The section of the Act that deals with offences, or the bill that deals with offences, is Section 30. I'll give you that in a second. I lost myself there for a moment, but I'll come back to it. The point that I was making is that the offences are going to be very heavy. They range from $50,000 in some instances to as much as $200,000, and to terms of imprisonment of as much as a year for offences under the Act. The nature of the offences are falsifying the license, providing false information to the inspectors, obstructing the police or authorized officers in the discharge of their functions. So under the new bill, under the Act, when it comes into law, there is an officer that is known as an authorized officer. First definition in the section 2 means a police officer, a public health officer of a regional corporation, an environmental officer of the Environmental Management Authority, or a scrap metal inspector. So those authorized officers will be empowered by the Minister of Trade and Industry to visit and inspect sites where scrap metal is being collected, to inspect containers where scrap metal is being loaded into, and to inspect vehicles which are transporting scrap metal from a purchaser to a scrap metal site. The identity of the purchasers, the identity of the licensees who have licenses to deal in scrap metal, all of that is prescribed in the Act in very great detail, so that at the end of the day, the public is reassured that they're dealing with bona fide persons. The licenses must be prominently displayed at the scrap metal sites, on the outside of the scrap metal site, and any vehicle that is being used, licensed to be used in the transport of scrap metal, must also prominently display the scrap metal collector's license in a manner in which persons on the outside of the vehicle can see that license and satisfy themselves that they are handing over to licensed collectors scrap metal to be transported to the site. So, in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, that's the frame of the legislation that's coming into effect. It consists of 37 clauses. Section 37 is to repeal the Old Metal and Marine Stores Act. Section 36, the minister may make regulations subject to negative resolution of Parliament to give effect to the purposes of the Act, and those regulations are going to be built out in consultation with the stakeholders in the industry over the next couple of weeks into the next couple of months. But we are aiming to get this legislation on the books by the end of this year. I'm happy to take your questions.
AG, good day, Gentlemen, you say, with regards to the inspectors, what qualifications, if you already added that up, would they need in order to be appointed as scrap dealers inspectors?
Yes, well, thank you for that question, Jensen, and that is something that the Ministry of Trade and Industry is working on, and that will be provided for in the regulations. So that is a work in progress. But they will be appointed by the Minister of Trade and Industry, subject to them satisfying the stipulated requirements and qualifications.
What is the new legislation say with regards to taxation, moving forward, taxation of the industry?
The new legislation, as I recall, does not make any specific provision for taxation. Persons who earn income from the sale of scrap metal will be taxed in accordance with the income tax laws in the normal course and operate under the general tax legislation. No specific exception or provision is made for persons dealing in the scrap metal industry.
And the licenses will be for how long and cost?
The licenses are, in the first instance, are going to be for 3 years from the date of issue, renewable, and the cost of the licenses vary as between dealers and collectors. If you just give me 1 second, if I know that the dealers pay a greater fee for license than the collectors. You just give me 1 second to address that, Mr. Fox. It's $500 in the case of the dealers, to my recollection, subject to verifying that, and $300 for the collectors. Subject to correction. When I find a specific section, I will come back and make sure I've got it right.
The dealers and collectors have to re-register under this new legislation, or would you are confirming those already in the system and new ones can come?
There's a transition provision, and that is actually provided for in the Act, and that transition provision allows all persons who currently have licenses under the existing legislation are allowed to continue to operate on those licenses under the new legislation until the date of expiry of those licenses. But from expiry, they must then apply for licenses which take effect for 3 years from the date of grant. They may apply even before the expiry of the existing licenses for new licenses under the new legislation, and that will then supersede what they have in place. But the transition is allowed.
So, in terms of the bill itself, any support from the opposition is needed or a simple majority?
A simple majority. We took particular care in drafting this legislation to ensure that we're not interfering with anybody's rights and fundamental rights in terms of intrusion on their rights. I'll give you an example of one of the things that was considered that may or may not have required a special majority. And it was interesting that it was a discussion I had only this morning with the representatives of the Stakeholders Association. A recommendation had been made which we considered and did not put into the bill to allow for 24-hour CCTV coverage of all scrap dealer sites. We did not include it because we thought that that could invade a right of privacy for 24-hour surveillance. And therefore, we did not go with that recommendation, which was made in order to ensure that we only needed to get a simple majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. This morning, I actually raised that as a question with Mr. Ferguson and other representatives of the Stakeholders Association, and they are very happy to have 24-hour CCTV coverage of all scrap metal sites. And therefore, with their agreement, if that is the agreement that we now have, and I am circulating a short brief of what the bill says to them today so that they can give me their further written comments. And if we come away with that agreement, then we will include it in the bill to the extent that the stakeholders have agreed that they would be happy to have 24-hour surveillance of scrap metal sites.
And this 24 hours will be provided by scrap dealers themselves or state?
No, it will be provided by the scrap dealers themselves. What we will do in the regulations is we will particularize the specifications of the cameras. So everybody will be required to buy and apply and use cameras according to a particular common specification.
And any penalties if the cameras go down?
That is going to be provided for in the regulations as we build that out.
Now, the Minister of National Security was at this meeting this morning.
Yes, with me were the Minister of National Security and the Minister of Trade and Industry at the consultation this morning.
Was he able to provide any detail with regards to the drop in theft for copper during the ban as compared to prior to the ban?
That did not arise in the discussions that we had this morning, but I can say from the information that I have that there has been a significant drop in the vandalism and criminality that caused the government to bring the ban into effect on the 12th of August in the first place.
Could you share some of the data that you have there?
I don't have it on hand. I will try to see if I can extract something, and if you all leave email addresses, I'll try to get that to you, but I don't have that on hand.
Now, the president of the association, Mr. Ferguson, was very concerned about the banning of copper, given that it's the truly bread and butter in the industry. I'm sure that was raised in the consultation. What comfort could you give to those in the industry that this one-year ban would not cut them off at the knee?
Well, I'll answer that with two answers. Yes, it was raised because I made it very clear in the consultation this morning that the ban on copper will continue for a year. And Mr. Ferguson was very vociferous in terms of the degree of hurt that members of his association will continue to experience. And he went as far as to ask us not to introduce it. On behalf of the cabinet, I think that, I did my best to get him to appreciate that the decision that has been taken by the cabinet to continue the ban for one further year is not a decision that has been taken lightly, but against the statistics of the damage to the national infrastructure of Trinidad and Tobago, the cabinet did not consider that it could raise the ban immediately. The thinking behind running it for a year is that once the new legislation and regulations take effect and we can get a regulated industry going forward, we will monitor the situation, and as we get more and more satisfied that we are now operating in a properly regulated scrap metal industry environment, we will keep under consideration the possibility of reducing that year. We will continue to have consultations with the stakeholders and, of course, continue to have consultations with the different entities who have been very badly injured with the vandalism and criminality that was occurring prior to the 12th of August. It will be kept under review, and I gave Mr. Ferguson, I was about to say Mr. Stakeholder, I gave Mr. Ferguson and the stakeholders that assurance. But for the time being, the ban remains for a year, and the government will review it at the end of the year.
And during this period, will an inventory be taken of the already recognized and registered scrap dealers, so that they won't have people hoarding copper, so when it becomes legal, they can now boost their profits?
Yes, I think that's a very good question, and certainly an inventory will be taken. In fact, one of the facts that emerged this morning in the consultation is, people made it clear that they are scrap dealers in copper, and they have quite a lot of copper on the ground, and what can they now do with their copper if the copper is not going to be allowed to be exported? So all of that has been taken into consideration as we build out the legislation.
And no consideration to allow them to export what they already have?
That will have to be discussed in Cabinet when we return to Cabinet. Take that information back to Cabinet.
In terms of the penalties, is that a monetary penalty and sentences, or how that?
It varies. So if I can just give you an example in terms of offences, in some cases it's just a straight monetary figure, and in other cases it's a monetary and imprisonment. So general offences, section 32 of the bill, a licensee who fails to keep proper records as prescribed under this act commits an offence and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $50,000. So if I can just pause there to mention two important facts that this reminds me of. One of the things that the bill requires is that licensed collectors and dealers must keep records. They must keep records of all of the people that they're buying scrap metal from and maintain written and electronic registers of all of the persons that they are dealing with in the scrap metal industry, and those records must collectors and licensed scrap metal sites. So that will also be virtual and online. So going back, Ms. Dowlat, to your question, subsection 2, a licensee who fails to verify the identity of a person from whom he purchases or receives scrap metal commits an offence and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $50,000. So in some cases you have straight fines. In other cases, and I'll give you an example, section 32, subsection 10, a licensed scrap metal collector who displays an invalid or false license, imputing that he is a licensed
This is TTT. Live